5 days after a C-section, I learned exactly what my husband thought I was worth. Not in a private argument. Not in a cruel text message. Not in a whisper behind a closed door. He showed me in public, under the glass entrance of a private hospital in San Antonio, while I stood there shaking in loose maternity pants, holding our newborn son against my chest, with my stitches pulling like fire under my skin. Mason opened the back door of our luxury SUV. For 1 second, I thought he was opening it for me. Then his mother, Patricia, slipped into the seat with her designer purse, her sunglasses, and the bored expression of a woman who had never lifted anything heavier than a wine glass. "Mason?" I whispered, because I still could not raise my voice without pain. "I need to sit down." He did not look at me. He folded the stroller, shoved it into the trunk, and said, "Mom gets carsick in ride shares." I stared at him. Our baby Noah made a tiny sound against my chest. His whole body fit between my shoulder and my heart. I had spent 3 nights in a hospital bed, telling myself that whatever was wrong in my marriage, I could survive it because he was here now. Then Mason closed the SUV door. "What are you doing?" I asked. He turned with that impatient look he used whenever I made his life inconvenient. His shirt was expensive. His watch was the one I bought him for our anniversary. Behind him, his mother adjusted the air vents like she was already irritated by my breathing. Mason reached into his pocket and pressed something into my palm. A crumpled 50-peso bill, not dollars, pesos. For a moment my mind could not understand it. "This isn't bus fare," I said quietly. He sighed. "There's a stop 2 blocks away. Exchange it somewhere, or ask the driver." "I don't know, Elena. Don't make a scene. Don't make a scene." Those 4 words hit me harder than the surgery had, because I knew what he meant. Do not cry where people can see you. Do not make my mother uncomfortable. Do not remind anyone that I just cut open my body to bring our son into the world. Do not make me look like the kind of man who would put his mother in the SUV and send his recovering wife to a city bus. "Mason," I said, "I can barely walk." "You're discharged, aren't you?" Patricia leaned forward and lowered her window. "In my day, women didn't behave like patients after giving birth. We handled ourselves." I looked at her painted mouth, then at Noah's sleeping face. Mason checked his phone. "Lunch is at 1. Mom hasn't eaten. I'll come back later if I have time." "If you have time," I repeated. His eyes sharpened. "You're starting again." That was what he called it whenever I asked for anything basic. Starting again, being dramatic, acting fragile. I wanted to scream. I wanted the nurse, the valet, anyone, to tell me I was not crazy. But Noah stirred. So I did what mothers learn to do before anyone teaches them. I swallowed the pain so the baby would not feel it. I looked at the 50 pesos in my hand, then I looked at my husband. And I realized something that should have terrified me, but somehow made me calm. Mason had forgotten whose SUV it was. He had forgotten whose name was on the penthouse lease. He had forgotten whose quiet signature had helped him get the loans, investors, introductions, and boardroom doors he liked to pretend he opened alone. Most importantly, he had forgotten that before I was his wife, before I was Noah's mother, before I became the woman who apologized for needing kindness, I was Elena Vargas. And there was one number saved in my phone that Mason had begged me never to use unless the world was burning. The SUV pulled away from the curb, glossy and black under the Texas sun, with my mother-in-law sitting where I should have been recovering. I stood there until it disappeared into traffic. Then I took out my phone. My hand shook, but my voice did not. When the call connected, I said, "Dad, I need you." There was a pause. My father, Rafael Vargas, did not ask useless questions. He had built Vargas Holdings from one delivery truck into one of the largest private logistics and real estate companies in the Southwest. He understood emergencies from the way silence sat between words. "Where are you?" he asked. "Outside St. Mercy Hospital." Mason left me with Noah. He took the SUV for his mother and gave me 50 pesos for the bus. The line went cold. Then my father said, "Do not move. I have to get home." "No," he said. "You do not have to get anywhere. People are coming to you." I should have waited. But humiliation is a strange fuel. It pushes you forward even when your body is begging you to stop. So I started walking. Every step sent a blade of pain through my abdomen. Sweat gathered at the back of my neck. Noah slept against me while the diaper bag strap slid down my shoulder and the hospital discharge papers bent under my arm. 2 blocks felt like 2 miles. When I reached the bus stop, a woman in purple scrubs looked me over and said, "Honey, are you all right?" I nodded because my pride was still fighting for its life. The bus arrived with a long sigh of brakes. I climbed the first step and nearly fell. The driver reached out. "Mom, I'm okay," I lied. I opened my palm and showed him the 50 peso bill. His face changed. He did not laugh. That almost made it worse. We can't take that, he said softly. I know, I said. I knew. Mason knew too. That was the point. Before I could step back down or disappear from shame, the woman in purple scrubs climbed up behind me and tapped her transit card. I've got her, she said. I turned. Please, no, I can. You just had a baby, she said. Sit down. Those words broke something open inside me. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were ordinary. A stranger understood what my husband refused to admit. I made it to a seat near the front. The bus lurched forward, and I wrapped both arms around Noah. My incision screamed. My eyes burned. 3 stops later, as we passed an upscale restaurant district, I saw our SUV. It was parked outside a steakhouse with a valet stand and white umbrellas. Mason stood beside it, laughing at something Patricia said. Then he opened the restaurant door for her with both hands, careful and respectful, like she was made of glass. He had never opened my hospital room door that way. The bus moved on. And that was when love left my body. Not slowly. Not after therapy. Not through one final argument. It left all at once. What I felt was cleaner than rage. Clarity. I lowered my face to my son's soft hair and whispered, I'm sorry I let him teach me to be small. Noah yawned in his sleep. My phone rang. It was my father's head of security. A calm woman said, Mrs. Hale. I looked at the 50 pesos still folded in my palm. Noah said. I said, Ms. Vargas? She paused only long enough to understand. Yes, Ms. Vargas. We have your location. Stay on the bus until the next major stop. A medical team and security detail will meet you there. For 2 years, Mason had mocked my family's money while spending it. He called my father controlling while enjoying the doors my father opened. He called me spoiled when I asked for kindness, yet he lived in a penthouse my trust paid for and drove the SUV my father gave me before the wedding. But Mason's greatest mistake was not cruelty. Cruel men expect tears. His greatest mistake was believing silence meant weakness. At the downtown transit center, 2 black vehicles were waiting. A man in a navy suit stepped forward before the bus doors finished opening. I knew him immediately. Daniel Ortiz had worked for my father since I was a teenager. He had driven me to school after my mother died, stood outside my college graduation, and once scared away a drunk man who followed me through a parking garage without ever raising his voice. When Daniel saw me carrying Noah down the bus steps, his expression did not change. That was his gift. He had seen everything, but he never made pain feel like a performance. Elena, he said gently. Give me the bag. The woman in purple scrubs helped me down. I turned to thank her, but my throat closed. She touched Noah's blanket. You take care of both of you, okay? I will, I said, and for the first time I meant it. A postpartum nurse guided me into the rear seat of the first car. A second nurse checked Noah. Someone placed a pillow carefully against my abdomen. Someone handed me water. Someone asked my pain level and believed the answer. That was the first time I understood how badly Mason had trained me. Being cared for felt almost illegal. We did not go to the penthouse. Daniel drove us to the river house, my family's estate outside the city. I had avoided it since my wedding because Mason said it made him uncomfortable. You turn into a different person there. He used to tell me. What he meant was, I stood taller. The gates opened before we arrived. My father was waiting on the front steps. Rafael Vargas was 71, but he stood like a man time had negotiated with instead of beaten. Silver hair, pressed white shirt, no tie, sleeves rolled once at the wrists, the way he dressed when business became personal. The car door opened. I looked at him and suddenly I was not a wife or a mother or a woman trying not to bleed through her dignity. I was his daughter. Papa, I said. His face changed for half a second. Just half. Enough for me to see the grief under the discipline. Then he helped me out carefully, one hand steady at my elbow, the other supporting Noah's back. I have you? He said. That sentence almost ended me. Inside, everything moved fast. A medical suit had been prepared in the west bedroom. A bassinet stood near the bed. A doctor examined my incision and frowned in a way that made my father turn very still. She needs rest, the doctor said. No stairs, no lifting, no stress. My father's jaw tightened. No stress, he repeated, as if he were making a promise to the room itself. By evening, I was in bed with Noah sleeping beside me. My father sat in the armchair near the window. Tell me everything, he said. So I did, not just the bus. Everything. How Mason changed after the wedding. How his mother started calling me delicate, in a tone that meant useless. How Mason moved into my penthouse and slowly began calling it his place. How he drove my SUV to investor meetings because it gave the right impression. How he told people my family was comfortable, never powerful, because he hated being seen as help. I told him about the pregnancy. How Mason complained that my morning sickness made the apartment depressing. How Patricia said modern women used pregnancy as an excuse. How he missed 2 appointments because of meetings. Then posted online from a golf course. How during labor, he asked the nurse whether they had a better chair because his back hurt. My father listened. He did not interrupt. When I finished, Daniel knocked and entered with a tablet. "Sir," he said, "Mr. Hale has called 26 times. He has sent multiple texts. He is also at the penthouse with his mother." My father looked at me. "Do you want to see the messages?" I nodded. The first message came 30 minutes after Mason abandoned me. "Where are you?" Then, "You made Mom anxious." Then, "This is childish. Come home before I get angry." Then, "Did you take the baby somewhere?" "Elena, answer me." For one foolish second, my heart softened at the word baby. Then I saw the next message. "If you're at your father's house, you better fix this before my investor dinner tomorrow. I'm not letting your drama damage my image." There it was. Not concern. Image. My father held out his hand, and I gave the tablet back. "Daniel," he said, "begin the file." Daniel nodded. "Already started." "The full one." I frowned. "What full one?" My father leaned back. "When Mason came into your life, I had him reviewed. You investigated my husband. I investigated the man who wanted to marry my only child." Anger rose, but it did not have enough strength to stand. "And you didn't tell me. You were in love," he said. "And I was trying not to become the villain in your story." The words landed exactly where they were meant to, because I would have called him controlling. I would have defended Mason. I would have said my father was judging him for not being born rich. "What did you find?" I asked. "Debt, ego, inflated contracts, a mother who treated him like a prince, and a sister who treated him like an investment. Nothing criminal at first. Just weaknesses. At first." Daniel's tablet chimed. He read the alert and looked at my father. "Sir, we have confirmation. Hale's company used the Vargas family connection in the Series B financing documents. Not your name directly, but the language implies relationship-backed support." "What does that mean?" I asked. My father stood. "It means Mason has been selling confidence he did not own." Daniel added, "There are investor decks showing the SUV, the penthouse address, and references to family-aligned strategic capital. He allowed lenders to believe Vargas Holdings would not let his company fail." I felt cold. Mason had told me he wanted to keep our finances separate because he was proud. He had been using me as collateral. "Is that illegal?" I asked. My father's expression did not change. "It is actionable." That word had weight in my father's world. Actionable meant lawyers. Actionable meant records. Actionable meant someone had mistaken kindness for a loophole, and now the door was closing. My phone buzzed Mason again. This time I answered. "Elena," Mason snapped before I spoke. "Where the hell are you?" I looked at Noah. His little fist rested against his cheek. "I'm safe, Seth." He laughed once. "You're unbelievable. My mother is crying because you pulled this stunt." "Did you ask how Noah is?" A pause. Then, irritated, "Don't twist this. You took my son without telling me." "Our son," I said. "You don't get to punish me because you were embarrassed." Embarrassed. That word opened a deep, quiet place inside me. "You left me at the hospital 5 days after surgery with a newborn and 50 pesos. You made it home, didn't you?" I closed my eyes. There it was. The entire marriage, boiled down into one sentence. "If you survived it, why are you complaining?" "No," I said. "I didn't go home." His voice dropped. "Where are you?" "At my father's." Silence. Then, softer. "Okay. You've made your point. Come back in the morning. We'll discuss it privately." Privately meant where he could shrink the truth. Privately meant where Patricia could sigh outside the door and Mason could call me unstable. Privately meant where no one would see what he had done. "No," I said. "Elena, I'm not coming back." His breathing changed. "You're emotional." "The hormones, the surgery." "Finish that sentence," I said quietly, "and it will be the last stupid thing you say to me without a lawyer present." Mason went silent. Then he laughed, but this time it was thinner. "A lawyer? Over a misunderstanding?" "No, over a pattern." I ended the call. My hand shook after, but not from fear. From the strange sensation of hearing my own voice again. Mason's life began to unravel at 8:17 a.m. That was when his chief financial officer received a formal request from Vargas Holdings' legal department demanding clarification of all investor materials, implying Vargas family support. At 8:31, the bank froze review of his expanded credit line. At 8:45, 2 board members asked for an emergency call. At 9:02, Mason texted me, "What did you do?" I was sitting in bed feeding Noah, wearing cotton pajamas and a robe, with sunlight crossing the floor in clean gold lines. I read the message and felt nothing. That scared me more than anger would have. My father came in carrying coffee and a folder. Inside were screenshots, emails, loan summaries, social media posts, and photos from Mason's pitch decks. There was our SUV in front of a private hangar. There was the view from my penthouse terrace. There was Mason at a conference, saying his company was backed by long-term family infrastructure experience. There were emails where he wrote, "My wife's side has deep relationships across logistics and real estate. We're not worried about operational support." My wife's side, not Alina, not Vargas, a shadow, a silent ladder. I turned another page. "What is this?" I asked. Daniel, standing near the door, answered, "A draft trust document." My blood slowed. For Noah. The document listed Mason as primary administrator over assets, expected through maternal inheritance channels. It was unsigned, but my name had been typed below a signature line. My father's voice went low. "Where did you find that?" Daniel said. "In a scanned folder attached to an email from Mason to his personal attorney, timestamped 2 weeks before delivery." I could not speak. Mason had not only used me, he had been preparing to use our son. "What did the email say?" I asked. Daniel glanced at my father. "Read it," I said. Daniel did. Mason had written, "Once Elena is settled after delivery, she will be easier to manage. Her father is old school and emotional about heirs. We should establish Noah's structure early, before her family interferes." Easier to manage. I handed Noah to the nurse before my arms went weak. Then I said, "I want full custody." My father did not smile, but the air around him changed. "Good." By noon, my lawyer arrived. Her name was Vivian Shaw, and she had the terrifying calm of a woman who could make a billionaire sweat by adjusting her glasses. She listened while I told the story again. This time it was not just pain, it was evidence. The hospital discharge time, the bus route, the woman in scrubs, the messages, the 50 peso bill, now sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve, because Daniel thought of everything. Vivian looked at it for a long moment. "He gave you this in Texas?" she asked. "Wes. And told you to take public transportation 5 days after major abdominal surgery, while carrying a newborn." "Les." She nodded once. "Judges dislike cruelty. They dislike stupidity almost as much." He gave us both. For the first time in days I laughed. It hurt, but it was real. That afternoon we filed for divorce, emergency custody orders, exclusive use of the penthouse, and protection over Noah's financial interests. We also filed to recover my SUV and freeze any documents that used my family connection without written authorization. Mason found out during his investor dinner. I did not plan that part. He had booked a private room at a downtown restaurant for investors, advisors, and his family. He wanted to announce a major funding milestone. He wanted cameras, he wanted applause, he wanted the room to believe he had built something unstoppable. At 7:14 p.m., his lawyer called Vivian. At 7:16, Vivian put him on speaker so I could hear. Mason's voice was sharp with panic. "Elena needs to withdraw this immediately." Vivian said, Vargas is unavailable. She is weaponizing her father's company because we had a marital argument." Vivian looked at me. I nodded. She said, "Mr. Hale, your wife alleges you abandoned her at a hospital entrance with inadequate transportation and a 5-day-old infant." "That's not abandonment." I knew she had a phone. Vivian's eyebrows lifted. Mason kept going, "Because men like him think silence means they are winning. And anyway, she exaggerates pain. She needed to toughen up." My mother said, "Mr. Hale." Vivian interrupted, "Are you aware this call is being documented by counsel?" He stopped. I almost saw the blood leave his face through the phone. Vivian continued, "Please have your attorney communicate in writing." She ended the call. The room was quiet. My father said, "He is not bright." Vivian slipped her phone into her bag. "No, but he is useful." Mason's investor dinner collapsed before dessert. 2 board members left early. 1 lender requested updated disclosures. His mother called me 14 times. His sister posted a vague message online about women who destroy families for attention, then deleted it when Daniel's team captured it. At 10:03 p.m., Mason finally sent the message I had been waiting for. "You don't understand what you're doing. If my company goes down, Noah's future goes down with it." I typed back one sentence: "Noah's future was never your company." Then I blocked him. 3 days later, I returned to the penthouse, not alone. Vivian came with me. Daniel came with me. 2 security officers came with me. A locksmith met us at the elevator, because Mason had changed the locks on a residence where he was not the leaseholder. When the elevator opened, I heard Patricia before I saw her. "She is mentally unstable," she was saying. "Postpartum women become irrational." Mason should have had her evaluated before she ran to her father. We stepped into the foyer. Patricia stood in my living room holding one of my coffee mugs. Behind her, open suitcases covered the floor. Her clothes hung over my dining chairs. In the nursery, the mobile above Noah's crib was gone, replaced by a framed photo of Mason as a baby. For a moment, I could not breathe. Patricia turned and went pale. Then she recovered. Elena, finally. You need to stop this nonsense. Vivian opened her folder. Mrs. Hale, this residence is leased solely in Ms. Vargas's name through a premarital trust. You are trespassing. You have 10 minutes to collect essential personal items and leave. Patricia's mouth opened. Excuse me. Vivian did not blink. 9 minutes. Mason came out of the bedroom, tying his tie with shaking hands. When he saw me, relief crossed his face first. That almost made me laugh. He still thought I was the emotional one, the one who could be pulled aside and convinced. Baby, he said, voice gentle now. Can we talk? There was a time that word would have weakened me. Now it sounded cheap. No, I said. His face tightened. So that's it. You're going to let your father ruin me. You ruined yourself. Because I asked you to take a bus. Because you thought I would. That landed. For the first time, Mason looked at me and saw someone he did not recognize. Good. I walked past him into the nursery. The room smelled faintly of Patricia's perfume. I opened the drawers and found Noah's blankets moved aside to make space for Mason's old baby clothes, yellowed with age and wrapped in tissue paper. I picked up one tiny blue blanket my mother had knitted before she died. Mason appeared in the doorway. Elena, he said quietly, you're taking this too far. I turned. No. Taking it too far was leaving me at a hospital with a newborn. Taking it too far was giving me currency I could not use. Taking it too far was using my name in investor documents and preparing paperwork to control my son's inheritance. His face changed. There it was. Not guilt, recognition. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Patricia's voice came from behind him. Mason, don't answer that. Vivienne from the living room said, excellent advice. I looked at my husband. For 1 second, I saw the man I married. The smile, the charm, the hungry ambition I mistook for drive. Then he disappeared again. You owe me, he said. The words were so naked that everyone heard them. I tilted my head. For what? For standing beside you. For dealing with your father. For living under the Vargas shadow. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. You didn't live under the shadow, I said. You lived off the shade. Court was not dramatic the way people imagine. There was no shouting, no sudden confession that made everyone gasp. There was a judge, a clock, polished wood, stacks of paper, and the quiet destruction of a man's favorite lies. Vivian presented everything in order. Hospital discharge records, security footage from the hospital entrance, the bus route, the transit card statement from the woman in purple scrubs, who gave a sworn declaration because she said she had a daughter of her own and could not stop thinking about me. Photos of the 50 peso bill, screenshots of Mason's messages, investor materials implying Vargas support, the unsigned trust draft for Noah, the email that said I would be easier to manage after delivery. Mason sat across the room in a navy suit, looking smaller than I remembered. Patricia sat behind him with a tissue pressed to her mouth. She cried at strategic moments. I could tell because there were no tears when the judge looked away. Mason's attorney tried to make it sound like a misunderstanding. A tired new father. A stressful delivery. A wife from a wealthy family overreacting. Then Vivian stood and read Mason's own words aloud. You made Mom anxious. Come home before I get angry. You don't understand what you're doing. If my company goes down, Noah's future goes down with it. The courtroom was silent. The judge looked at Mason over the top of her glasses. Mr. Hale, she said. At any point in these messages, did you ask whether your newborn child arrived safely? Mason shifted. No, Your Honor. Did you ask whether your wife required medical attention? No, Your Honor. Did you provide usable fare for the public transportation you directed her to take? His jaw tightened. I gave her money. Vivian said, Your Honor. He gave her 50 pesos. The judge's face did not move, but her pen stopped. In Texas, Vivian added. Mason looked down. That was the moment he finally understood. Not when he left me. Not when I called my father. Not when the investors froze. Not even when he was removed from the penthouse. He understood when a stranger in a black robe held up the smallest cruelty and made it visible. Because that was what men like Mason fear most, not consequences, witnesses. The temporary custody order granted me primary physical custody. Mason received supervised visitation pending further review. The court restricted him from making financial decisions involving Noah. The penthouse remained mine. The SUV was returned to me with a court order and a very embarrassed valet manager. But the real collapse happened outside family court. The forensic audit triggered investor panic. Mason's board removed him from leadership within 2 weeks. Without borrowed prestige, he was no longer a visionary founder. He was a liability in an expensive suit. My father did not threaten anyone. He did not need to. He simply corrected the record. Vargas Holdings had never guaranteed Mason Hale, his company, his loans, or his future. The market did the rest. 3 months later, the divorce mediation took place in a conference room with glass walls and a view of downtown San Antonio. Mason arrived late. He looked tired. Not broken, exactly. Men like him rarely break in ways that make them humble. They break in ways that make them resentful. His watch was gone. I noticed that first. He sat across from me and stared at the table. Patricia was not there. For once he had come without his mother. "I loved you," he said. Maybe he believed that. Maybe in his mind, love meant wanting access to someone, wanting their softness, wanting their name in the room, their money in the background, their silence in public, their forgiveness on demand. But I had a son now. I could not afford childish definitions. "No," I said. "You loved what being married to me allowed you to pretend." His mouth tightened. "You always run to your father." I looked at him for a long moment. I crawled to a bus stop 5 days after surgery because I was still trying not to run to my father. He had no answer to that. The settlement was clean. I kept what was mine before marriage. Mason kept what remained of his personal assets. He agreed to child support based on recalculated income and surrendered any claim to Noah's future inheritance. He signed a statement acknowledging that no Vargas entity had ever backed his company. He also agreed to a communication plan through a parenting app, because I was done letting his voice enter my life whenever he felt entitled to it. At the end, Vivian slid one final document across the table. Mason frowned. "What is this?" "A property return acknowledgement," she said. "For the SUV." His face flushed. "I already returned it." "Not fully." Daniel stepped into the room and placed a small plastic evidence sleeve on the table. Inside was the 50 peso bill. Mason stared at it. Vivian said, "Ms. Vargas is returning this to you. It was the only marital asset you personally provided for her transportation that day." For 1 second, nobody spoke. Then Mason looked at me. His eyes were wet, but I did not trust that. "Tears can be another form of negotiation, Elena," he whispered. I stood carefully. My body had healed by then, but I still moved with respect for what it had survived. "You told me not to make a scene," I said. "So I made a record." I left before he could answer. Outside, the sky was wide and blue. My father walked beside me to the elevator. When the elevator doors closed, he reached over and took my hand. "You know," he said, "your mother would have liked that line." I laughed softly. "Which one?" "So I made a record." I looked at our reflections in the elevator doors. I saw the tiredness in my face, the strength underneath it, the woman I had almost lost and the mother I was becoming. "I wish she were here." I said, "She is," he answered. "In every part of you that refused to stay small." When I got back to the river house, Noah was awake. The nurse handed him to me, and he looked up with that serious newborn stare, as if he had just arrived on Earth and already suspected adults were ridiculous. I carried him to the window. Beyond the glass, the oak trees moved in a soft wind. The world looked ordinary. That surprised me. After everything, I expected the sky to look different. I expected some visible sign that my life had split in two. But healing is quiet. Justice is often paperwork. Freedom can sound like a baby breathing against your chest. I did not become fearless after that. People love to tell stories that way. Like one act of revenge turns a wounded woman into steel forever. That is not true. Some mornings I still woke up angry. Some nights, I replayed the hospital entrance and wondered how long I would have stayed if Mason had chosen one kinder sentence. But then Noah would make a little sound from his crib, and I would remember. I did not leave because Mason stopped loving me. I left because I started loving my son more than I feared starting over. 6 months later, I drove the SUV myself for the first time since the hospital. For months, I had avoided it. I hated the memory of Patricia in the back seat, Mason at the wheel, and me standing on the curb with my body cut open, and my dignity in my fist. But that morning, Noah had a pediatric appointment, and the driver was delayed. So I took the keys. My hands rested on the steering wheel. For a moment, the old panic rose. Then I looked in the rearview mirror. Noah was strapped safely into his car seat, wearing tiny socks with bears on them, kicking one foot like he was impatient with my drama. I smiled. "You're right," I told him. "We're not afraid of cars." I pulled out through the gates and drove into the bright San Antonio morning. At a red light downtown, a city bus stopped beside us. The same route. Maybe not the same driver. Maybe not the same vehicle. But close enough that my chest tightened. I looked at the bus doors. I thought of the woman in purple scrubs tapping her card. I thought of the driver's gentle face. I thought of the 50 pesos in Mason's hand, and the way he believed humiliation would keep me quiet. Then the light turned green. I drove forward, not fast, not dramatically. Just steady. That was the part no one tells you about revenge. The best revenge is not watching someone fall. It is becoming impossible to leave behind. Years from now, when Noah is old enough to ask why his father and I did not stay married, I will not tell him every ugly detail. Children do not need adult bitterness as inheritance. I will tell him the truth in a clean way. I will say, your father forgot how to be kind, and I had to protect our peace. And if he asks whether I was scared, I will say yes. Because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is carrying a newborn, a surgical wound, and a crumpled piece of useless money onto a bus, then deciding that the story will not end there. Mason thought 50 pesos could measure my place in his life. He was wrong. It measured the distance between the woman I had been and the woman I became. And every time I hold my son, every time I sign my own name, every time I enter a room without shrinking, I remember the lesson he paid for with everything he thought he owned. Never humiliate a woman who has already survived the pain you were too weak to honor. Because sometimes, the bus ride is not the fall. Sometimes it is the road back to yourself.